It's impossible." His concentration was so great that he didn't know he had spoken aloud. He closed one eye entirely, then opened it slowly. Hoping against hope, he then worked his tongue into a corner of his cheek and rotated it about. He watched, stared. A pulse was drumming fiercely in his forehead as he backed away from the mirror. He had first noticed it a short time ago, 7 days to be exact. It is logical to suppose that he would have known of it sooner if he had been a vainer man. Most certainly then he would have looked into mirrors a great deal oftener. But Jay Swartz was a mild man, a meek man, a man completely devoid of ego. He wore his habits the way he wore his clothes, soberly. He did not sin, he would not. He did not cheat, he could not. 3 drinks before dinner, and his reactions unmistakably informed him that he'd had enough. He was like that. Once again, he shot a covert glance at the mirror. There it was, plain to see. Jay Swartz had been brought up properly, but that is an expression that has lost its true meaning. To speak with exactitude, it is better to say that he had been brought up primly. In an era where modesty was considerably more than a fetish, an era where the most innocuous words called down condemnation upon the luckless user, Jay Swartz's family proudly outdid themselves in righteous self-effacement. Completely cloaked with the mantle of selflessness, or so they insisted, they balanced themselves with practiced step upon the tightrope of virtue. No matter the season, their bodies were swathed in layer upon layer of raiment. Indoors, their comportment was such as to assure them front-row seats in the heavenly orchestra of harpists, or so they insisted. Jay had never been one to rebel. He was the sort born to accept orders unquestioningly. If, even in the privacy of one's room, it was immodest and wrong to undress before dousing the lights, he carefully put out the lights before removing his breeches. His parents had instructed him. He obeyed them. If he had to go to the lavatory, it would never do to say so. That would have been grievously shocking. Any simple excuse to leave the room was acceptable under those conditions, but never the immodest truth. But all these bugaboos paled before the one strict, immutable rule that pervaded the Swartz household. Serving the interests of virtue, one might do everything in one's power, and then fail. How? By looking, smiling at, daring to admire one's reflected form in a mirror. The human form was a debased thing of evil that only served to lead its owner off the garden path. Thus, logically, it was a thing to remain unseen, avoided. Jay's father used it for shaving. That was its purpose. One of Jay's most memorable recollections was the time that he had been caught. He'd lost a tooth, as boys will, and was entirely engrossed in exploring the bloody cavity with an inquisitive finger. The mirror helped a great deal as he probed and poked, until... Jay! He swerved, nearly upsetting himself, and paled. Yes, father? Ungodly brat, you were lasciviously admiring yourself. I don't understand, father. Do not trifle with me. I have explained the sin often enough. It was the big word I didn't understand, and honest, I was just fooling. Which is as far as Jay got. His gasp was cut off as a gnarled hand jerked at the back of his collar. The shaving strop was seized, raised aloft, then brought down with a singing swish. Jay's cry of pain suffered the same brief span that his gasp had lasted. The steadily flailing strip of leather effectively stifled everything but an agonized wish for death. Again and again it rose and fell. The regularity was monotonous, the pain eventually indescribable. Things, after a while, resolved into a whirling world of unrelieved torture. Again and again rose the leather flail. Down and down it beat against the semi-conscious jerking form that was Jay Swartz. Jay finally fainted. A graphic experience is forever etched upon the consciousness of a child. Jay never forgot that beating. It had the constant impact of a sledgehammer swung against a huge brazen gong. The reverberations went on and on. Jay grew older and finally left home to establish his own way in the world. He trod in minor paths. Luckier than most men, he never was troubled by an all-consuming ambition. The highways for others, the byways for him. A small job, a small room, these quite comfortably fitted his small desires. His position with a large insurance company was safe and steady. Nobody resents a man who doesn't covet positions that aren't better than his. Nobody wields an economic knife against a man who is supremely satisfied to trudge a tuneless treadmill. He was accepted with the same careless complacence that is usually associated with a slightly worn piece of office furniture, and he was considered very much as devoid of personality or hidden depth. But they would have all been surprised. He did have a secret. Jay Swartz was still afraid of mirrors. Psychologically conditioned by the ultra-stern conditions of his youth, his fear never diminished. To the contrary, it fed upon itself and grew constantly, morbidly. A man incapable of making living enemies, he found himself in the anomalous position of having an inanimate foe. He used mirrors as sparingly as was humanly possible. Brushing his teeth and washing his face were easy, no ordeal there. But shaving was a shuddering time of terror that had to be agonized through every morning. And now, it's impossible. But it was possible. It was there, plain to see, plain to see. Even as his eyes clung to the mirror and his mouth was drawn thin with horror, his reflection was laughing at him. His hand stole to his face. His reflected hand didn't. There were new lines in his face, but his mirrored face was full and untroubled. His eyelids twitched uncontrollably, but not so in the likeness that was flung back at him. Horribly, silently, the face in the mirror kept laughing and laughing. It had been a week ago that he had first noticed. A week ago that his reflection had rebelled. A week ago that his mirrored personality had begun defying him. It might have begun sooner. He hadn't noticed, until one morning it had winked obscenely at him, and ever since. He remembered, now, the ancient Germanic legend of the man who had met his double. It had been wringing its hands. Death. He fought himself, but his eyes shot toward his reflection. It was grinning, wringing its hands. The psychiatrist wielded his pen with sure, broad strokes. A man untroubled by personal ghosts. A man who slew the morbid fancies and terrorizing thoughts of others. He scratched a last notation, his lips forming the inaudible words, psychosis, autosuggestion. Jay squirmed forward in his chair as the psychiatrist leaned back and studied him. Does it mean I'm crazy? The other's full, rich, carefully practiced tones fell upon Jay Swartz like a protective benediction. No, absolutely not. You are as sane as I am. This last accompanied by a resonant chuckle. Then the thing I see can't hurt me? It is impossible for it to hurt you. Impossible because you do not see it. But doctor, please, a moment. Well-manicured fingers interlaced themselves across a well-padded stomach. From what you have told me, you are a man pursued by phantoms. It is not your fault, Mr. Swartz. You have related how your boyhood was completely dominated by a thorough abnegation of healthy emotion. No outlets at all. Well, sir, what is the result? What? As you grew older, Mr. Swartz, you cast off the narrow outlook with which you were most effectively swaddled. You didn't know it, but you did. And, due to the inexorable law of nature, you began to think for yourself. That, of course, brought its, problems. I don't understand. Let us put it this way. A man who has been perishing of thirst will not allow logic to stand in his way when he is confronted with plenteous water. He will drink and drink until he is uncomfortably sated. If undeterred, he will become rather sick. You, Mr. Swartz, are that thirsty man. I see. Exactly. You had a thirst for normalcy. It was, during your childhood, consistently denied to you. You left home and found yourself with an all-consuming thirst for being a healthy ego, for being natural. You follow me. It wasn't a question, but Jay Swartz felt constrained to answer, yes? It was getting so clear now, so normally explainable, that he had to show his improvement by joining in and approving of the logical explanation. Well, sir, you overdid yourself. The abrupt change to a normal way of living and acting stirred up half-forgotten vistas of your unfortunate youth, subconsciously, that is. Once again, you were being threatened with unfair punishment, inwardly, of course. You probably never even perceived, suspected. The first sign was the product of an overworked, though to you unsuspected, imagination. The fear complex. The worry over being hideously punished, as you told me you were, because you were doing something that is unalterably natural. But doctor, my remaining fear of mirrors. You are not afraid. Mr. Swartz, believe me, you only think you are afraid. That is why you've been avoiding mirrors with such careful conscientiousness these past few years. As the snake struggles to shed its skin, so you are struggling. And, forgive the comparison, as the reptile finally emerges in new shining armor, so you are emerging. Then what shall I do? Face your phantom, Mr. Swartz. Defy it. Gaze into your mirror steadily, without fear. Your clouded imagination will be cleared by the calm, cooling breezes of reason. Look into my mirror steadily. Precisely. Drive out the false visions that have been plaguing you so unfairly. Once gone, they will never return. On that, I stake my reputation. It was a new Jay Swartz who turned the key of his small apartment. It was a new Jay Swartz who tossed his coat onto the bed. It was something he had wanted to do all his life, a life given to circumspectly genuflecting to all the hallowed proprieties. That was over. Done. He was a snake shedding its dull skin for a brighter one, a butterfly emerging in innocent glory from its dull chrysalis, a man. He turned toward the bathroom. He couldn't help the feeling of aversion, of fear. But wasn't he now a man? He was, incontestably. Hand upon the door. Fear. Twist the knob. No, think. Psychiatrist's advice. Unlearned man. Helps people who need guidance. Twist the knob. Try. Sweat forming on a corrugated forehead. Twist the knob. Everything explained. Logically. Exactly. Mathematically. Truthfully. That last very important. Twist the knob. And he was inside. Walk up to the mirror, boldly. Stare steadily, unafraid. Block out the false phantoms. Do it, it's easy. One leg before the other, go ahead. Hesitation only hurts, makes things harder. Foolish, nothing to be worried about. All carefully explained. Habits of a lifetime. Lurking, unfair, no substance. All explained, figments, palpably worthy of derision. Go ahead. And he was before the mirror. Open your eyes, stare, steadily. Open your eyes, nothing can hurt you. It will help, teach you the truth. Help you, open broad lanes to happiness. Wipe out the past, the gray past, the punishing past. Open your eyes, see the new world, your world. Open your eyes. And he opened his eyes. His reflection, nothing to worry about, it looked at him, and he looked at it, calm, both calm as it should be. Expressions the same, as they should be. Psychiatrist right, as he should be. Learned man, wise man, helpful man. Good advice, best advice. Go ahead, stare at it. Staring. Pride, strength, new feeling of... No, can't be. Impossible. Psychiatrist said so. Learned man, wise man. Look again. No. Reflection, laughing. Silently, utterly impossible. Wise man said so. Wealth of experience, can't be wrong. Good advice, best advice. Heed it, heed it. Stare at reflection. Glare at reflection. Don't give up. Must win. Must win. Don't give up. Stare. And he screamed, and he screamed. He caught himself, lurched out of the bathroom. This was no time to give way to disordered mental stabs. More than evident that his ancient enemy was weakening, employing last hopeless trickery. This was triumph. Triumph. Get a bit of help. Nothing shameful about using all the means at one's disposal to rid oneself of a dying enemy. Nothing to do with one's manliness. The enemy must be destroyed. That is the only important thing. Answering the telephone call, the psychiatrist finally arrived. A bit put out because he'd been disturbed at his meal, but cloaking his irritation and impatience with the thought of adding a substantial amount to an already padded bill. Look, doctor, the mirror. What about it? Can't you see? No, you can't. All I see is that you have a reflection, which is as it should be. But it reacts differently. That's why I called you. I don't understand. Don't you see? It, my enemy, is still there. However, I'm not afraid. It is a figment, I know it. You told me so. But it is there, to be destroyed. Isn't that progress? The psychiatrist, backing up, professionally polite. Words that have no meaning. Professional, backing to the door. Understanding. I'm sorry I troubled you, sir. It was nothing at all. Quite all right, Mr. Schwartz. Just take my advice. Don't be afraid. And he was gone. Failure. The psychiatrist had lied. Evident. He had seen it too. Wouldn't admit it. Have to help oneself. The only way. Use any means. Out with logic. Forswear what is fallaciously taught. Seek that which can really help. Seek that which is ridiculed and mocked, but secretly feared. Seek the strange powers that all jibe at, because the true answer is there for the asking. Many libraries, many bookstores, laughing faces, incredulous faces, sneering faces. He knows. They sneer and mock because they are afraid, cannot seek truth as he does, tirelessly. And then, an old bookshop, an old man, incredibly, nodding, understanding, tottering to an inner room, a book, musty, ancient, refusal of payment, smiling. J. Schwartz entered his apartment. He opened the book and studied. He smiled. It was all so easy. How much simpler if he had done this first. He read on. There was the diagram to chalk upon the floor. He drew it. There were the multi-syllabled invocations to intone. He intoned them. There were the careful passes through the air, the repetition of certain odd phrases, the lit match that must scorch his fingertips. And, as it must be, the crouching shape was there, motionless. The shape that would rid him of the rebellious reflection in the mirror. The shape that would take the horror out of his life. It would exact a tribute. That was to be expected. J. Schwartz was happy, truly happy. He cast a sidelong glance at his mirrored reflection. Could it be? Yes. It was already losing its shape, becoming tenuous, transparent, wearing a look that Jay knew was one of helpless pleading. No time for mercy. Too many years of subjugation. Destroy. Without conscience, destroy. The reflection of him was wavering, almost gone, fighting, hopelessly, going, gone. And the crouched figure stirred itself, slowly unbent, looked up for the first time. J. Schwartz threw a frantic look at his mirror. No reflection. No reflection at all. Blank. Blank. The figure straightened and stepped over the chalked lines. It was going to exact its tribute. J. Schwartz knew this. He also knew that he had incarnated his double, brought it to life. It was wringing its hands which suddenly swooped to J. Schwartz's throat. He knew so many things. Too late. January 3rd. This affair of White and Witherspoon's accounts proves to be a gigantic task. There are 20 thick ledgers to be examined and checked. Who would be a junior partner? However, it is the first big bit of business which has been left entirely in my hands. I must justify it. But it has to be finished so that the lawyers may have the result in time for the trial. Johnson said this morning that I should have to get the last figure out before the 20th of the month. Good Lord. Well, have at it, and if human brain and nerve can stand the strain, I'll win out at the other side. It means office work from 10 to 5, and then a second sitting from about 8 to 1 in the morning. There's drama in an accountant's life. When I find myself in the still early hours, while all the world sleeps, hunting through column after column for those missing figures which will turn a respected alderman into a felon, I understand that it is not such a prosaic profession after all. On Monday, I came on the first trace of defalcation. No heavy game hunter ever got a finer thrill when first he caught sight of the trail of his quarry. But I look at the 20 ledgers and think of the jungle through which I have to follow him before I get my kill. Hard work, but rare sport too, in a way. I saw the fat fellow once at a city dinner, his red face glowing above a white napkin. He looked at the little pale man at the end of the table. He would have been pale too if he could have seen the task that would be mine. January 6th. What perfect nonsense it is for doctors to prescribe rest when rest is out of the question. Asses. They might as well shout to a man who has a pack of wolves at his heels that what he wants is absolute quiet. My figures must be out by a certain date. Unless they are so, I shall lose the chance of my lifetime, so how on earth am I to rest? I'll take a week or so after the trial. Perhaps I was myself a fool to go to the doctor at all, but I get nervous and highly strung when I sit alone at my work at night. It's not a pain, only a sort of fullness of the head with an occasional mist over the eyes. I thought perhaps some bromide or chloral or something of the kind might do me good. But stop work? It's absurd to ask such a thing. It's like a long-distance race. You feel queer at first, and your heart thumps and your lungs pant, but if you have only the pluck to keep on, you get your second wind. I'll stick to my work and wait for my second wind. If it never comes, all the same, I'll stick to my work. 2 ledgers are done, and I'm well on in the 3rd. The rascal has covered his tracks well, but I pick them up for all that. January 9th. I had not meant to go to the doctor again, and yet I've had to. Straining my nerves, risking a complete breakdown, even endangering my sanity. That's a nice sentence to have fired off at one. Well, I'll stand the strain and I'll take the risk, and so long as I can sit in my chair and move a pen, I'll follow the old sinner's slot. By the way, I may as well set down here the queer experience which drove me this second time to the doctor. I'll keep an exact record of my symptoms and sensations, because they are interesting in themselves. A curious psychophysiological study, says the doctor. And also because I'm perfectly certain that when I am through with them, they will all seem blurred and unreal, like some queer dream between sleeping and waking. So now, while they are fresh, I will just make a note of them, if only as a change of thought after the endless figures. There's an old silver-framed mirror in my room. It was given to me by a friend who had a taste for antiquities, and he, as I happen to know, picked it up at a sale and had no notion of where it came from. It's a large thing, 3 feet across and 2 feet high, and it leans at the back of a side table on my left as I write. The frame is flat, about 3 inches across, and very old, far too old for hallmarks or other methods of determining its age. The glass part projects with a beveled edge, and has the magnificent reflecting power which is only, as it seems to me, to be found in very old mirrors. There's a feeling of perspective when you look into it, such as no modern glass can ever give. The mirror is so situated that as I sit at the table, I can usually see nothing in it but the reflection of the red window curtains. But a queer thing happened last night. I had been working for some hours, very much against the grain, with continual bouts of that mistiness of which I had complained. Again and again I had to stop and clear my eyes. Well, on one of these occasions I chanced to look at the mirror. It had the oddest appearance. The red curtains, which should have been reflected in it, were no longer there, but the glass seemed to be clouded and steamy, not on the surface, which glittered like steel, but deep down in the very grain of it. This opacity, when I stared hard at it, appeared to slowly rotate this way and that, until it was a thick white cloud swirling in heavy wreaths. So real and solid was it, and so reasonable was I, that I remember turning, with the idea that the curtains were on fire. But everything was deadly still in the room. No sound save the ticking of the clock, no movement save the slow gyration of that strange woolly cloud deep in the heart of the old mirror. Then, as I looked, the mist or smoke or cloud or whatever one may call it seemed to coalesce and solidify at 2 points quite close together, and I was aware, with a thrill of interest rather than of fear, that these were 2 eyes looking out into the room. A vague outline of a head I could see, a woman's by the hair, but this was very shadowy. Only the eyes were quite distinct, such eyes, dark, luminous, filled with some passionate emotion, fury or horror, I could not say which. Never have I seen eyes which were so full of intense, vivid life. They were not fixed upon me, but stared out into the room. Then, as I sat erect, passed my hand over my brow, and made a strong conscious effort to pull myself together, the dim head faded into the general opacity, and the mirror slowly cleared, and there were the red curtains once again. A skeptic would say, no doubt, that I had fallen asleep over my figures, and that my experience was a dream. As a matter of fact, I was never more vividly awake in my life. I was able to argue about it even as I looked at it, and to tell myself that it was a subjective impression, a chimera of the nerves, begotten by worry and insomnia. But why this particular shape? And who is the woman, and what is the dreadful emotion which I read in those wonderful brown eyes? They come between me and my work. For the first time I have done less than the daily tally which I had marked out. Perhaps that is why I've had no abnormal sensations tonight. Tomorrow I must wake up, come what may. January 11th. All well, and good progress with my work. I wind the net, coil after coil, round that bulky body. But the last smile may remain with him if my own nerves break over it. The mirror would seem to be a sort of barometer which marks my brain pressure. Each night I have observed that it had clouded before I reached the end of my task. Dr. Sinclair, who is, it seems, a bit of a psychologist, was so interested in my account that he came round this evening to have a look at the mirror. I had observed that something was scribbled in crabbed old characters upon the metalwork at the back. He examined this with a lens, but could make nothing of it. Sank ex pal was his final reading of it, but that did not bring us any farther. He advised me to put it away into another room, but after all, whatever I may see in it is, by his own account, only a symptom. It is in the cause that the danger lies. The 20 ledgers, not the silver mirror, should be packed away, if only I could do it. I'm at the 8th now, so I progress. January 13th. Perhaps it would have been wiser after all if I had packed away the mirror. I had an extraordinary experience with it last night. And yet I find it so interesting, so fascinating, that even now I will keep it in its place. What on earth is the meaning of it all? I suppose it was about 1 a.m, and I was closing my books preparatory to staggering off to bed, when I saw her there in front of me. The stage of mistiness and development must have passed unobserved, and there she was, in all her beauty and passion and distress, as clear-cut as if she were really in the flesh before me. The figure was small, but very distinct, so much so that every feature and every detail of dress are stamped in my memory. She is seated on the extreme left of the mirror. A sort of shadowy figure crouches down beside her. I can dimly discern that it is a man, and then behind them is a cloud, in which I see figures, figures which move. It is not a mere picture upon which I look. It is a scene in life, an actual episode. She crouches and quivers. The man beside her cowers down. The vague figures make abrupt movements and gestures. All my fears were swallowed up in my interest. It was maddening to see so much and not to see more. But I can at least describe the woman to the smallest point. She is very beautiful and quite young, not more than 25, I should judge. Her hair is of a very rich brown, with a warm chestnut shade fining into gold at the edges. A little flat-pointed cap comes to an angle in front and is made of lace edged with pearls. The forehead is high, too high perhaps for perfect beauty, but one would not have it otherwise, as it gives a touch of power and strength to what would otherwise be a softly feminine face. The brows are most delicately curved over heavy eyelids, and then come those wonderful eyes, so large, so dark, so full of overmastering emotion, of rage and horror, contending with a pride of self-control which holds her from sheer frenzy. The cheeks are pale, the lips white with agony, the chin and throat most exquisitely rounded. The figure sits and leans forward in the chair, straining and rigid, cataleptic with horror. The dress is black velvet. A jewel gleams like a flame in the breast, and a golden crucifix smolders in the shadow of a fold. This is the lady whose image still lives in the old silver mirror. What dire deed could it be which has left its impress there, so that now, in another age, if the spirit of a man be but worn down to it, he may be conscious of its presence? One other detail. On the left side of the skirt of the black dress was, as I thought at first, a shapeless bunch of white ribbon. Then, as I looked more intently, or as the vision defined itself more clearly, I perceived what it was. It was the hand of a man, clenched and knotted in agony, which held on with a convulsive grasp to the fold of the dress. The rest of the crouching figure was a mere vague outline, but that strenuous hand shone clear on the dark background, with a sinister suggestion of tragedy in its frantic clutch. The man is frightened, horribly frightened. That I can clearly discern. What has terrified him so? Why does he grip the woman's dress? The answer lies amongst those moving figures in the background. They have brought danger both to him and to her. The interest of the thing fascinated me. I thought no more of its relation to my own nerves. I stared and stared, as if in a theater, but I could get no farther. The mist thinned. There were tumultuous movements in which all the figures were vaguely concerned. Then the mirror was clear once more. The doctor says I must drop work for a day, and I can afford to do so, for I have made good progress lately. It is quite evident that the visions depend entirely upon my own nervous state, for I sat in front of the mirror for an hour tonight, with no result whatever. My soothing day has chased them away. I wonder whether I shall ever penetrate what they all mean. I examined the mirror this evening under a good light, and besides the mysterious inscription, Sank Ex Pal, I was able to discern some signs of heraldic marks, very faintly visible upon the silver. They must be very ancient, as they are almost obliterated. So far as I could make out, they were 3 spearheads, 2 above and 1 below. I will show them to the doctor when he calls tomorrow. January 14th. Feel perfectly well again, and I intend that nothing else shall stop me until my task is finished. The doctor was shown the marks on the mirror and agreed that they were armorial bearings. He is deeply interested in all that I have told him, and cross-questioned me closely on the details. It amuses me to notice how he is torn in two by conflicting desires, the one that his patient should lose his symptoms, the other that the medium, for so he regards me, should solve this mystery of the past. He advised continued rest, but did not oppose me too violently when I declared that such a thing was out of the question until the 10 remaining ledgers have been checked. January 17th. For 3 nights I have had no experiences. My day of rest has borne fruit. Only a quarter of my task is left, but I must make a forced march, for the lawyers are clamoring for their material. I will give them enough, and some to spare. I have him fast on 100 counts. When they realize what a slippery, cunning rascal he is, I should gain some credit from the case. False trading accounts, false balance sheets, dividends drawn from capital, losses written down as profits, suppression of working expenses, manipulation of petty cash. It is a fine record. January 18th. Headaches, nervous twitches, mistiness, fullness of the temples, all the premonitions of trouble, and the trouble came sure enough. And yet my real sorrow is not so much that the vision should come, as that it should cease before all is revealed. But I saw more tonight. The crouching man was as visible as the lady whose gown he clutched. He is a little swarthy fellow with a black pointed beard. He has a loose gown of damask, trimmed with fur. The prevailing tints of his dress are red. What a fright the fellow is in, to be sure. He cowers and shivers and glares back over his shoulder. There is a small knife in his other hand, but he is far too tremulous and cowed to use it. Dimly now I begin to see the figures in the background. Fierce faces, bearded and dark, shape themselves out of the mist. There is one terrible creature, a skeleton of a man, with hollow cheeks and eyes sunk in his head. He also has a knife in his hand. On the right of the woman stands a tall man, very young, with flaxen hair, his face sullen and dour. The beautiful woman looks up at him in appeal. So does the man on the ground. This youth seems to be the arbiter of their fate. The crouching man draws closer and hides himself in the woman's skirts. The tall youth bends and tries to drag her away from him. So much I saw last night before the mirror cleared. Shall I never know what it leads to and whence it comes? It is not a mere imagination, of that I am very sure. Somewhere, sometime, this scene has been acted, and this old mirror has reflected it. But when? Where? January 20th. My work draws to a close, and it is time. I feel a tenseness within my brain, a sense of intolerable strain, which warns me that something must give. I have worked myself to the limit. But tonight should be the last night. With a supreme effort, I should finish the final ledger and complete the case before I rise from my chair. I will do it. I will. February 7th. I did. My God, what an experience. I hardly know if I'm strong enough yet to set it down. Let me explain in the first instance that I am writing this in Dr. Sinclair's private hospital, some 3 weeks after the last entry in my diary. On the night of January 20th, my nervous system finally gave way, and I remembered nothing afterwards until I found myself 3 days ago in this home of rest. And I can rest with a good conscience. My work was done before I went under. My figures are in the solicitor's hands. The hunt is over. And now I must describe that last night. I had sworn to finish my work, and so intently did I stick to it, though my head was bursting, that I would never look up until the last column had been added. And yet it was fine self-restraint, for all the time I knew that wonderful things were happening in the mirror. Every nerve in my body told me so. If I looked up, there was an end of my work, so I did not look up till all was finished. Then, when at last, with throbbing temples, I threw down my pen and raised my eyes, what a sight was there! The mirror, in its silver frame, was like a stage, brilliantly lit, in which a drama was in progress. There was no mist now. The oppression of my nerves had wrought this amazing clarity. Every feature, every movement was as clear-cut as in life. To think that I, a tired accountant, the most prosaic of mankind, with the account books of a swindling bankrupt before me, should be chosen of all the human race to look upon such a scene. It was the same scene and the same figures, but the drama had advanced a stage. The tall young man was holding the woman in his arms. She strained away from him and looked up at him with loathing in her face. They had torn the crouching man away from his hold upon the skirt of her dress. A dozen of them were round him, savage men, bearded men. They hacked at him with knives. All seemed to strike him together. Their arms rose and fell. The blood did not flow from him, it squirted. His red dress was dabbled in it. He threw himself this way and that, purple upon crimson, like an overripe plum. Still they hacked, and still the jets shot from him. It was horrible, horrible. They dragged him kicking to the door. The woman looked over her shoulder at him and her mouth gaped. I heard nothing, but I knew that she was screaming. And then, whether it was this nerve-wracking vision before me, or whether, my task finished, all the overwork of the past weeks came in one crushing weight upon me. The room danced round me. The floor seemed to sink away beneath my feet, and I remembered no more. In the early morning, my landlady found me stretched senseless before the silver mirror, but I knew nothing myself until 3 days ago, when I awoke in the deep peace of the doctor's nursing home. February 9th. Only today have I told Dr. Sinclair my full experience. He had not allowed me to speak of such matters before. He listened with an absorbed interest. "You don't identify this with any well-known scene in history?" he asked, with suspicion in his eyes. I assured him that I knew nothing of history. "Have you no idea whence that mirror came, and to whom it once belonged?" he continued. "Have you?" I asked, for he spoke with meaning. "It's incredible," said he, "and yet how else can one explain it? The scenes which you described before suggested it, but now it has gone beyond all range of coincidence. I will bring you some notes in the evening." Later. He has just left me. Let me set down his words as closely as I can recall them. He began by laying several musty volumes upon my bed. "These you can consult at your leisure," said he. "I have some notes here which you can confirm. There is not a doubt that what you have seen is the murder of Rizzio by the Scottish nobles in the presence of Mary, which occurred in March 1566. Your description of the woman is accurate. The high forehead and heavy eyelids combined with great beauty could hardly apply to two women. The tall young man was her husband, Darnley. Rizzio, says the Chronicle, was dressed in a loose dressing gown of furred damask, with hose of russet velvet. With one hand he clutched Mary's gown, with the other he held a dagger. Your fierce, hollow-eyed man was Ruthven, who was new risen from a bed of sickness. Every detail is exact." "But why to me?" I asked in bewilderment. "Why, of all the human race, to me?" "Because you were in the fit mental state to receive the impression. Because you chanced to own the mirror which gave the impression." "The mirror! You think then that it was Mary's mirror, that it stood in the room where the deed was done?" "I am convinced that it was Mary's mirror. She had been Queen of France. Her personal property would be stamped with the royal arms. What you took to be 3 spearheads were really the lilies of France." "And the inscription?" "Sanct ex Pal. You can expand it to Sancte Crucis Palatium. Someone has made a note upon the mirror as to whence it came. It was the palace of the Holy Cross." "Holyrood," I cried. "Exactly. Your mirror came from Holyrood. You have had one very singular experience, and have escaped. I trust that you will never put yourself into the way of having such another." Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sear memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief, nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower, which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined, and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of somebody mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forests. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser, and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs, till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as of haunted and venerable mold assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height I had once attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless, crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, hoped when necessary to pry it up again. Believing I was now at prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles, and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen, save in dreams, and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open, for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demonic of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on the level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows, where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never, seemingly, heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic, several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment, alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and disillusion, the putrid dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort towards flight, a backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nefren Ka in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.